Hi and welcome to this short tutorial where we're going to be using Final Gather in the Sky Dome to get some nice quick overall illumination into our scene. So the first thing you need to do is that you need to create the Sky Dome. We'll use a NURB sphere for expedience, and you want to scale this one up really large so that you can move around inside of it. And also whenever you're working with these kind of sky domes, you want to keep in mind that your floor plane needs to be scaled up as well so that it penetrates the dome itself. Otherwise you'll get illumination coming from the bottom half, which can give you some very strange results. So if you don't have a floor plane for some reason, you need to delete the bottom half of this sphere. So with this done, I just want to do a quick render of this, a default. It's just a very generic test scene with some revolved NURB surfaces. And you can see here that the lighting we get is not very nice. What you have in the default light set is actually a directional light. Since you have no control over this and you can't place it, you can't really use it a lot, so you'll need to add your own lights into the scene to get something that will actually look a lot nicer than this. So if we save this render so we can take a look at it later, we need to go into our render settings. And when you're using Final Gather, you need to use Mental Ray, because Final Gather is a feature of Mental Ray. And you can find this under Indirect Lighting. If you look here, we've got Global Illumination and Final Gathering. So we'll just check this one. If you want physically accurate results, you need to use these two in combination. But for something like this, you can get some really nice quick results by using just Final Gather itself. You can see here Maya will even tell you this. So keep this in mind. If you're doing something that's going to be physically accurate in the future, you'll need to use them in combination. But they're both fairly complicated, and it requires a bit of reading to understand what all these different attributes do. And in terms of rendering times, you'll increase them by using indirect illumination. So you want to be sure you know what you're doing when you're rendering with these things. So another thing we need to do when we use indirect illumination is that we need to disable the default light set, because as we don't actually create any lights in our scene at this point, the default light set will still be active and it will interfere with the indirect illumination. So with this setup, what we need to do with our sky dome is that we need to give it a material. I'm just going to give it a Maya Lambert for now. And if we look at the material here, what we're going to do is that we're going to set this ambient color up. So this material will actually work as our main light source in the scene. So you can tweak this depending on how bright you want your illumination to come out. And now we're going to render this. And you can see in this render with something like this, if we compare them, that it looks completely different. You're getting a much more natural sort of light. You also get some soft shadowing. So one thing you can see here is that we've got this bright sky dome in the background, which doesn't really look that nice. So to get rid of this one, you need to select your dome, and then if you look in the shape node here, you'll have a tab for render stats. So if you go into your render stats and you turn off the primary visibility, and now we'll just render this again. And you can see if you look at this now that it looks a lot better. We don't have this bright shiny dome, but we're just receiving illumination for it. One thing that looks a bit strange in my render is that I have these very reflective materials, but you can see they have no specular highlights. And this is because with indirect illumination you won't get specular highlights, neither can you get sharp shadows. So if you want these kind of crisp shadows, or you have materials that need specular highlights, you'll also need to add some kind of direct illumination into your scene. So in my case, I'm going to add a spotlight. A spotlight is what is preferred as shadow casting lights most of the time. So if we go down to lights, spotlight, and to aim the spotlight we can do it one out of two ways. We can either look through the spotlight itself and aim it that way, or you can use the manipulator tool, which you'll get up by pressing T. So if we look at the attribute editor here, you can see that you can adjust the cone angle to fit with what's in your scene. I'm going to set mine back to 40. And you can also add some penumbra, which will soften this cone that will fall on the floor when we're using a spotlight. Usually a value around 5 will work quite well. So you can also see, normally you would actually want to add a camera when you're rendering something like this, because lights are set up specifically. So you can see I've offset mine to be to the side of the view I'm going to render from, which is here. So I'll set this back to perspective, and I'll just show you quickly how to set up a camera as well. So same thing here, you can just go create cameras, and as with the spotlight, you can just look through it. Trying to aim a camera any other way than this would not be a very good idea. So if we do something like that, and then you can just set your panel back to be perspective view, and then you can move around as you want without worrying about how your render is actually going to come out. So in order to get this to render through our actual camera, we need to open our render view. We need to go to render, and you can see here it says current, which means it's currently going to render perspective. So if we just select camera 1, we'll re-render this. In the case of the spotlight, you could also use it, you could light link it to your objects so it wouldn't appear on your floor plane if this is something you wouldn't want. But it works okay. So if you look at the difference here now, you can see that we're getting these specular highlights, which were missing before. So this result is a lot more realistic, of course, because a highly reflective surface would have specular highlights of some kind. You can see that this render looks very strange now though, and this is because I haven't turned on any shadows. So for lights in Maya you will need to turn on shadows. By default these will be off. So if we select our spotlight and we go down to shadows here, you can see you have the option between using either depth map shadows or ray trace shadows. So in most cases you would want to use depth map shadows with spotlight because they come out extremely well. But in the case of using them in combination with final gather, like here, I'm going to show you what will happen. So you can see here how they come out very strange. And this is because spotlights are based on actual maps. So you have resolution maps. And because when you're using final gathering, this can cause some problems because you need to increase final gather points for this and change your settings. And when you start to take resolution for something like depth map shadows up, because this would increase the number of pixels that would be used to calculate a depth map, when they go up quite high, this is kind of a stupid solution because you might actually increase your render times more than you would using ray trace shadows from the beginning. So the reason for why you want to use depth map shadows is simply because they're more efficient. So in a case like this, you'd be better off using ray trace shadows. So if we render with this instead. So if we look at this render now, you can see this looks a lot better. If we compare it, you can see that we need these shadows to get any kind of realism in our shot. So another thing you want to keep in mind in terms of quality when you're rendering out a final shot for something is that I think because I'm so far zoomed out, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. But I just want to show you the quality presets. If you look under quality here, you can see this is set to custom, where you can create your own custom settings, which you can save. So, but depending on what you're doing, a lot of the time you want to set your settings up to production quality, because this will give you the best results. So for rendering out preview shots and things like this, just to reduce your rendering time, stick with preview, because it's a lot faster. So just a quick note on this, because if you look at the rendering times here, I've paused for rendering, but you can see this actually takes 27 seconds to render out. I've got reflective material, so you need to consider that when you have things like reflectivity, multiple objects in your scene, final gather rays calculated from sample points, this will start to increase render times, and final gather can be quite render consuming, so make sure you learn your settings quite well if you want to use this for anything else than something as simple as this. So just to take a look at what we had when we started, you can see that just by doing this, we've gone from something that looked like this, which is not very nice at all, to something that looks like this, which is quite pleasant to look at. So that's just a quick note on lighting. I hope that will help you a little bit. Bye for now.